At my father's birthday dinner, I handed him a framed photo, one of him and me at my law school graduation. He didn't even look at it. He pushed it aside, turned to my brother, and raised a toast to the real future of this family. My mother clinked her glass without a word. I just sat there, my hands still on the frame, like a child waiting for a pat on the head that never came. They called me dramatic when I left early, but they didn't see me crying in my car in the empty parking lot, gripping that photo like a lifeline. They never did. Weeks later, my brother invited me to a gala, said I should come as I almost said no, but I went, thinking maybe this time, just maybe, they'd see me. Not as a failure, not as a shadow, just me. I wore a dress I hadn't touched in years and stayed near the back, where the important people wouldn't notice. Then it happened. The governor, his boss, walked past the crowd, stopped, looked me straight in the eye, and said with genuine shock,
"Wait, you're the senator?" And in that second, the look on my family's faces said it all. That wasn't pride. It was panic. Because the person they'd spent years ignoring had just been recognized by the most powerful man in the room. They didn't clap. They didn't smile. They didn't speak. But their silence, it finally meant something.
But before I share my story with you, I want to know you're here with me. Just say listening in the comments, or let me know where you are. I love hearing how far my story reaches. Sometimes even the smallest connection can make a story feel heard. If any part of this touches you, please subscribe. It helps this story find someone else who's been told they're not enough. Thank you. And now, here's my story. Des Moines was never quiet. Even in winter, when the snow muffled footsteps and made the air sharp enough to slice skin, the Whitmore household buzzed with unspoken expectations. My father, Douglas Whitmore, was a name that held weight at every courthouse bench in Country Club. He once came close to being appointed to the state Supreme Court, close enough that my mother, Janine, had already picked out the rug for his office. My younger brother, Leo, was the next golden boy, a rising star in political science at Drake University, all charm and calculated modesty. And then there was me, Carla, the firstborn, the one they once said was the future of justice in Iowa. For years, I believed them. I poured my soul into the state legal office, specifically into an audit of a massive healthcare contract that had bled millions from public funds. It wasn't glamorous. Long nights, buried in spreadsheets, listening to whistleblowers whisper like hunted animals, but it mattered. Until I found the emails, coded payments, deleted calendar invites, a shell company, and then his name, my father's name, tied to payouts, meant to silence a nurse who threatened to go public about patient neglect in a privatized elder care project. I filed a report through the official whistleblower channel. I did it by the book. Every line, every timestamp backed by evidence. But within 72 hours, the headlines exploded. Whitmore legacy tarnished, daughter under investigation for evidence tampering and plagiarized reports. I watched the evening news. Silence. The footage showed me leaving the courthouse, face turned from the camera like a criminal. Then came my father's interview. He didn't mention my name, but his tone was enough. It's disheartening. We raise our children with values, but sometimes they lose their way. That night, dinner was unbearable. My mother's silverware clinked like a ticking bomb. She didn't look at me when she said, "If you're too reckless to protect this family's name, don't expect to live under its roof."
Leo, sweet, soft Leo, didn't even make eye contact, just sat stiff like he was trying to disappear. I wanted him to say something, anything.
He didn't. I packed my things the next morning. No one offered help. Then Sarah, my best friend, my colleague, my roommate in law school, leaked internal emails to the press. Her betrayal gutted me more than the public disgrace. Later, I learned she'd been paid off by a firm representing one of the healthcare contractors. Her message was short. Don't hate me. You always had this hero complex. You want justice? This is what it cost. They all made it clear I wasn't welcome anywhere. I left Des Moines under cover of night, a single duffel bag and a prepaid phone in hand. I didn't cry. I didn't even sleep. I took a bus to nowhere and let it drop me off at Glenbrook, a speck on the Missouri border where nobody cared who I was or what I'd done. At the bus station, I scribbled the first line in a cheap notebook. They say I failed. Maybe I did, but I'm still breathing, and I won't let them write my ending.
I changed my name to Kate Monroe. Monroe after my grandmother, the only person who ever told me that silence was complicity. I rented a room above an old bookstore where the windows creaked and the heater wheezed like it had its own story to tell. Each night I stared at the ceiling and repeated the words like a prayer. If I can't trust justice to protect me, then I'll become justice itself.
And in the shadows of that worn down town, something started to burn. Not brightly, but steadily. A fire that no scandal could extinguish. Denbrook didn't care who I was before, and that was its greatest mercy.
It was the kind of town where the streets went quiet after 7, and the grocery store closed on Sundays not out of religion but exhaustion. People here didn't talk about politics unless it was about the rising cost of diesel or another neighbor losing their land to a developer.
It was broken in familiar ways, and no one pretended otherwise. That suited me just fine. I became Kate Monroe quietly, without ceremony. I rented the narrow room above the used bookstore and took a job at the library teaching writing classes for adults. The room smelled like old paper and cinnamon. Nobody asked why I wore the same gray coat every day or why I avoided local gatherings. I told them I used to be a teacher. That was technically true. They didn't press. It was during one of my late evenings at the library, thumbing through state bulletins out of habit, that I found a proposed bill to cut funding for Glenbrook's prisoner reentry program. It wasn't headline news. No one was marching about it. But if passed, it would kill the only chance dozens of ex-inmates had to rebuild their lives.
I've met some of them in my writing classes. Men who wrote about nightmares with the kind of grammar you only learn when your trauma sits too deep for small talk.
My hands shook as I read it, not with rage, but purpose. That night, I dusted off the old skills. I drafted a policy response line by line, citing data, case studies, constitutional precedent. I didn't sign my name. Instead, I created a fictional nonprofit, Midwest Community Voice, and sent it through a back channel I still knew from my old days in Des Moines. 3 days later, the bill was pulled from the docket for further review. I didn't celebrate. I just wrote one sentence in the back of my notebook next to a growing list of names. I am not allowed to show up, but I can leave footprints. Soon, word got around, not about me, but about someone called KM, a name whispered in activist circles across Iowa, the one who could clean up your draft and make it bulletproof.
I never met the organizers face to face. I didn't want thanks, I wanted effect. By the third anonymous project, I'd found a strange rhythm.
By day, teaching former dropouts how to write essays. By night, quietly dismantling bad legislation. It wasn't redemption, but it was motion. And motion for someone who's fallen is everything.
Then came Daniel. He was a literature teacher at the local high school, always in corduroy jackets and mismatched socks. He ran the monthly book club at the library, and we kept bumping into each other over the same copy of To Kill a Mockingbird.
The first time he smiled at me and said, "You again," I felt my stomach twist. Not from nerves, but from the memory of being spoken to, without suspicion. He was kind. Not the kind that's loud or performative, but the kind that notices when you've read a sentence twice and asks if you're really okay.
It quoted Baldwin and made jokes about grammar like it was sacred. Slowly we started talking. Books, justice, how schools were failing boys who couldn't sit still and girls who were too loud. He never asked about my past. And that's what made me ache, because I started to care about our conversations, about how his voice softened when he read aloud, about how I didn't have to wear armor around him, but I still couldn't tell him the truth. Not about Carla Whitmore, not about the scam, not about the family that had cut me out like a tumor. I wanted to believe that Caitlin Rowe could deserve happiness, but even in the quiet warmth of Glenbrook, I knew shadows never stayed buried for long. It started as a glance, Daniel reaching across my cluttered desk for a book and pausing. His eyes landed on the papers I had carelessly left half-folded under a stack of class rubrics and marked up essays. He pulled the draft free with a puzzled look and skimmed the first paragraph. My blood chilled. "This," he said, holding the page delicately like it might burn him, "is the same argument that came out last week from KM. The same words, even the structure. Did you write this?" I froze. It would have been easier if he'd yelled or accused, but his voice was soft, curious, almost hopeful. That was what made the lie taste worse. I smiled too quickly. "It's not mine. Not really. I just help a few groups get their language tight. Sometimes they need help making the legal language digestible." Daniel stared at me for a long second, then nodded slowly. He didn't press, but I saw it in his eyes. A line had been drawn. I'd pretended it wasn't there, but it was. And I had stepped behind it. Still, the days that followed felt almost dreamlike. We found our rhythm again, walking together after book club, cooking quiet dinners in his small kitchen, debating the themes of Baldwin and Morrison late into the night. He read to me in the mornings, and I found myself watching his hands more than the page. He smelled like cedar wood and chalk dust, and when he touched my shoulder, the world quieted. But I never let him past a certain door. When he asked about my family, I laughed it off, said we weren't close. When he brought up where I used to work, I mumbled about teaching at private schools. I rapped half-truths in warm tones and trusted he wouldn't unravel them. He didn't try, not. Now sometimes I'd catch him watching me, not suspicious, just uncertain, like he was waiting for a story to finish itself. And then came the night everything shifted. We had just come back from a public forum at the town hall, small, dusty, passionate. Local organizers had gathered to discuss changes to probation policies, and I had to bite my tongue the entire night not to correct the sloppy logic in the proposed amendments. Daniel noticed my tension, but said nothing until we were alone outside, under a sky of brittle stars. He stopped walking. "Carla," he said softly, using my real name before I even realized it had slipped into the wind. "I love you, but I can't build a future on a foundation. I don't understand. You don't trust me enough to be honest with me. And maybe that means you don't trust yourself yet either. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. I couldn't speak without breaking." Not that night. The next morning, he was gone. On my kitchen table sat a letter, written in his careful teacher's scroll. "I don't need perfection, but I need the truth. I believe in second chances, but not when someone refuses to take the first." The silence he left behind was louder than any argument. I sat at my desk that night and opened my journal, the one I never let anyone see, and I wrote, "I fight for justice. I rewrite laws for strangers, but if I can't be honest with the man who saw me as whole, does any of it matter?" My heart didn't crack. It folded in on itself. The next morning, I walked to the library and pretended nothing had changed. I taught a workshop on writing persuasive arguments, and not long after, a young man explained his fear of parole hearings. I even smiled when I passed Daniel's classroom door, but the cracks beneath the surface began to widen. 2 days later, as I sipped stale coffee in the back corner of the bookstore, my eyes caught a familiar name buried deep in a local opinion column, "The Senator in Shadow." It was a speculative piece, one of those half-serious, half-clickbait rumors about a mysterious figure allegedly shaping statewide policy from somewhere in the border towns. No name was given, but the phrases used, the tone, the structure were mine word for word. My fingers trembled as I reread the final paragraph. Some believe the Senator in Shadow is closer to the Capitol than we think. One thing's for certain, whoever they are, they've rattled the right cages. I closed the paper, heart pounding. Somewhere, someone was connecting dots. The trail I tried to erase was starting to shine, no longer hidden beneath good intentions. And in that moment, I understood. I hadn't just lost Daniel. I had invited danger back in. It was a Thursday when my mother's voice scraped across the phone line, brittle and sharp like the first frost of November. I had called just to check in. A fool's errand, I knew, but some broken parts of me still believed family meant something. She didn't ask how I was, didn't ask where I was. Instead, she sighed, loud enough to make her disapproval echo across state lines. "At least Leo makes us proud," she said. "He's on TV now, always so composed, always in a suit, not like you, vanishing into nowhere." I didn't reply. I'd learned silence could cut deeper than argument, and besides, she wasn't calling to hear from me. She wanted me to hear her, that her son, the golden boy, had risen while her daughter became a whisper. I knew Leo was working for Governor Alan Fwy. I'd seen the occasional press clipping, the polished grin behind podiums, the buzzwords of reform without substance. He was becoming the party's new poster child for young promise. I used to wonder if he thought of me at all in those moments, if the shadow of my downfall ever flickered behind his eyes. Apparently not. What I didn't know, what would twist the knife, was that during a closed-door campaign strategy meeting in Des Moines, someone had asked Leo about his political background. If there was anyone else in his family with policy experience, eager to impress, he smiled and said, "My sister, actually, she used to work at the state legal office, brilliant at policy language. She lives somewhere down near Missouri now, Carla, but she's not really involved anymore." Just like that, my name was back in circulation, and just my luck, Sarah Benton was in the room. I didn't know that part until later, of course. At that moment, I was probably sipping bad coffee and scribbling notes in the margin of a new reform proposal. But while I lived quietly, Sarah never did anything quietly. The same Sarah, who once shared my dorm room in my dreams, now sat at the heart of the governor's media war room. When she heard my name, something clicked. Later, I imagined the exact way her face must have twisted, recognition laced with malice. She would have leaned back in her chair, eyes narrowing, calculating. It wouldn't take long for her to dig, and she did. She scoured the archives, called in favors from digital media analysts, reviewed every op-ed submitted by anonymous nonprofits in the last 3 years, and eventually she found it. One article submitted under the pseudonyms Senator M, a tight, unrelenting piece dismantling a regressive welfare policy proposal. In the middle of it was a sentence, a particular turn of days I used often in my law days. Justice delayed is corruption disguised in civility. Sarah knew that line. I'd written it once on the whiteboard in our shared office, back when we were interns at the Attorney General's office. She'd mocked me for it then, saying it was too dramatic. Now she recognized it instantly. I didn't hear her voice, but I could picture the sneer, the cold satisfaction curling around her words as she said aloud to no one, "If this is Carla, I'll end her again, and this time she'll stay buried." I imagine her calling her new press assistant, snapping her fingers to get someone on background research. She'd frame it not as revenge, but as vetting a potential liability. And maybe, just maybe, she'd justify it as protecting the governor. But I knew Sarah. This wasn't about politics. It never was. She hadn't forgiven me for surviving the last time. Back in Glenbrook, I felt the first ripple without knowing why. My library email was flooded with strange requests from obscure publications asking for interviews. My recent anonymous submissions were being flagged for tone resemblance to political commentary previously attributed to high-level consultants. A friend from one of the nonprofit boards warned me, "Someone's digging Kate. Be careful. Be careful." As if I hadn't lived every day since Des Moines with my pulse on the edge of exposure. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the floor of my apartment with every piece of paper I'd ever written in this new life. I wasn't scared, not exactly. I was something colder, prepared, because I knew one thing. If Sarah had sniffed me out, she wouldn't just come with gossip. She'd come with a plan. The Landmark Hotel in Des Moines always had the scent of polished brass, old money, and political ambition baked into its walls. That night, it glittered under chandeliers, the size of small satellites, for the spring gala hosted by Governor Alan Fayette. The guest list was a parade of who's who. Donors, strategists, power brokers, and a few carefully curated names, meant to dazzle behind the scenes. One of those names printed without a photo, without a title, just a simple Senator M, was me. I hadn't planned to come, but when the invitation arrived, hand-delivered with a note that your words moved policy, let us celebrate the ideas, not the face. I knew this was more than a gala. It was a collision waiting to happen. I wore a black evening gown with a high neckline, simple pearl earrings, and no makeup, but for a shade of red I hadn't touched since Des Moines. I arrived deliberately late, hoping to slip into the room unnoticed. But Glenbrook had taught me timing was often the most powerful form of speech. As I entered the marble lobby, I almost collided with a sharply dressed young man checking his phone, flanked by a woman in a satin emerald dress. The man looked up. Leo, my brother, he looked older, sharper, but his eyes were still that same stormy gray I remembered from childhood. For a moment, he stared at me. "Sorry, man. Are you looking for the media lounge?" I smiled faintly. "Just took a wrong turn. Thank you." He tilted his head, something flickering in his eyes.
You look really familiar, like my sister before she went. Well, never mind. I nodded and moved on. Behind me, I heard him murmur to the woman next to him. "It's Sarah. Weird. She really looked like Carla, back before she went. You know, Sarah's gaze lingered on me longer." Inside the ballroom, champagne sparkled and violence whispered through air thick with calculation. People smiled with their mouths and measured each word like currency. I stood near a corner, near enough to observe, but not participate, until Sarah slithered toward the governor, whispering something behind her perfect teeth.
"Governor, see the woman near the west pillar? That's Senator M. I think it might be Carla Whitmore. You know, the one who caused that mess years ago." He raised an eyebrow.
"Whitmore, the same. Could be." The writing, the tone, it all fits. Governor Foy glanced my way, curiosity piqued. Moments later, he approached with a glass of water in hand. "That is Senator Enyev, I presume." I don't know. I've been impressed with your critiques on the Medicaid restructuring. The phrasing in your last letter, "a policy that punishes illness and rewards indifference," was familiar. "It's a shared sentiment among many in Glenbrook," I said carefully. He squinted slightly. "I've read something like that before, from a case file, years ago. Tell me, what's your real name?" I didn't blink. "Carla Whitmore." There was a pause. 5 seconds, maybe less. but long enough for nearby heads to turn. The governor's face shifted from skepticism to amusement.
You're that Carla Whitmore?
His voice rose slightly, just enough to draw a half circle of attention. Then, almost reverently, "You're the senator?" My name rippled through the room like a match catching on silk. Sarah paled. Leo froze. My mother, 2 tables over, dropped her champagne flute with a crystalline crash. My father, mid-conversation with a former Supreme Court nominee, turned slowly and locked eyes with me.
I took a breath, stepped forward just enough to be seen clearly. Yes, I said, I never stopped fighting. I just didn't need a family name to do it. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was awe. In that moment, I wasn't a disgraced daughter. I was a force standing in her own light. And for the first time, they had to look directly at me.
The morning after the gala, I woke to a world I barely recognized. My phone, an old scratched flip model I kept for its simplicity, buzzed nonstop. Not with texts from friends or allies, but with news alerts, email subject lines screaming my name in links that sent my stomach hollowing out. The headlines were merciless. Senator N unmasked as disgraced lawyer Carla Whitmore, from whistleblower to master manipulator. My face, frozen mid-expression from years ago, was everywhere. They dug up the old articles, repackaged them for a new audience, added polished AI-generated narrations, and dark ambient music that made my legal suspension sound like a felony indictment. And then came the video. It wasn't real, but it didn't have to be. It had my face, my voice, and a carefully stitched confession built from manipulated fragments of a disciplinary hearing I once endured. They'd taken my words, statements of legal complexity about burden of proof, risk management, and procedural irregularities, and edited them into a grotesque admission of guilt. I took the documents. I misled the court. I am not who they think I am. Only I never said those sentences in that order, but that didn't matter now. Within hours, I learned the source. Westfall Medical, the very conglomerate whose sweetheart state contract I derailed years ago, had found their moment. My anonymous reforms had started to bite. They lost 2 local bids, a tax exemption clause, and a backdoor funding channel I'd quietly helped close.
They retaliated not with lawsuits, but with a smear campaign. And Sarah, she wasn't just watching, she was orchestrating. The fake accounts came first. Comments swarmed under every story about me. She's just another elitist in disguise. Fake name, fake morals, trust fund, and activist clothing.
Then came the email leak, heavily redacted, conveniently stripped of context, and designed to cast every anonymous memo I'd written in the worst possible light. Someone spray-painted the word liar across the front of the Glenbrook Community Library. Beneath it, in dripping red letters, snake in heels. When I stepped inside, no one looked at me. The volunteer at the front desk, whom I once helped write a grant proposal, suddenly couldn't meet my eye. Then came the interview. It was Henry, an ex-convict I had personally helped find work through a rehabilitation program, standing in front of a camera, coached within an inch of his dignity, saying, "Maybe I was wrong. Maybe she just used us." I knew the words weren't his. Westfall had twisted his parole funding until he bent. Still, it hurt. The betrayal wasn't personal, but the pain was. And nothing hit me harder than Daniel. I didn't even know he had met with Sarah until the broadcast. She found him, spun her version of me. An opportunity building her political comeback using him as a prop.
She showed him the doctored video, the altered screenshots, the emails that could be read a dozen ways, and Daniel, who once quoted Atticus Finch to me under Moonlight, was now on local radio saying, "I think I was just part of her strategy."
Maybe I was the small-town credibility she needed.
You know, I heard it while driving back from a record as I pulled into the gravel driveway of the old bookstore. My name, my life, my intentions were being reduced to a soundbite. I turned off the engine, but didn't move. The world outside was silent. Inside, I felt every crack widen. There were no tears, just a stillness, a quiet so heavy it pressed into my bone. Maybe I should have expected this. I always knew stepping back into the light meant inviting shadows to follow, but I didn't think Daniel would echo their voice. That was the blow I hadn't armored myself against. I sat in the darkness of that car for what felt like hours until the night gave way to a thin gray morning. And still, I said nothing, because the next move couldn't come from rage, it had to come from resolve. When the news came that the education reform bill I'd spent months drafting was being put on hold, I didn't feel anger. Not right away, just a dull, pressing silence. as if someone had shut a door. I didn't realize it was my last way out. The email from the Senate office was sterile, careful, filled with phrases like pending further clarification and we hope to revisit when appropriate. I read it 3 times before closing my laptop and staring into the hollow room around me. No lamps, just the bluish glow of the monitor and the fractured reflection of myself in the cracked glass. It didn't stop there. One by one, the senators I had once shared midnight strategy calls with began to retreat. A few sent polite texts, one even called apologetic but firm. We need to do some vetting before we can attach our names again. And just like that, the fortress I had built through diligence, clarity, and anonymous merit collapsed beneath the weight of my name. I opened my journal, my one remaining sanctuary, and wrote, I chose invisibility to protect what I believed in. Now that I'm visible, they call me a fraud. Should I have stayed silent forever? The silence didn't save anything, and neither did speaking. Then came the next blow.
The Pro Bono Legal Center.
I had helped build from nothing. The place where single mothers and immigrant workers came for advice they could never afford elsewhere, lost as primary grant funding. The reason Westfall Medical had been one of the largest silent donors. Of course they had. While I thought we'd won a battle years ago, they were laying landmines under my future. A week later, one of the junior staffers, scared about losing his job, leaked a string of private emails between me and a few senators. They were mundane, policy discussions, outlines, minor frustrations. But taken out of context, they were spun by my enemies into accusations of backroom lobbying. At midnight, I sat in the legal center's front office, surrounded by empty chairs and cracked windows. Vandals had shattered the front pane last week. I hadn't had the budget to replace it. I held the printout of Daniel's old letter in one hand and a still from the doctored video in the other. One claimed I was incapable of love, the other incapable of truth. And then I wrote, if justice must survive in hiding, is it still justice? The next morning, something strange happened. While sorting through flyers and overdue bills in the mailbox, I noticed a letter, a real one. Paper yellowed, handwriting slanted and scratchy. No return address, just to Carla Whitmore.
I opened it slowly. Miss Whitmore, it began. You are the only one who didn't look at me like I was trash. Because of you, I got a second chance. My daughter knows my name now. She calls me Dad. I haven't missed a paycheck in 6 months. You did that. Please, don't give up on the rest of us.
Alack, I had to sit down. The wind came through the cracked glass like breath. Soft, unfiltered, honest.
I didn't wipe my face. I let the tears sit there. Let them remind me that something still lived in me. Something true. Then I stood up, walked to my desk, opened my laptop, and typed one sentence into an email addressed to my lawyer. I want to sue Westfall, and I'm not interested in a settlement. I knew better than to use old allies. Politics make people forgetful. So I contacted a group of independent legal investigators, off-grid, underfunded, and full of the kind of zeal that comes from having been burned. They didn't care about my past. They cared about evidence. And then I found Lena. She was a journalist once. Westfall destroyed her career after she tried to publish a piece connecting their campaign donations to offshore PAC.
I met her in a dimly lit diner off Route 6. Her eyes were sharp, her voice low. They killed my story, cost me my press pass. She said, but if you're ready to speak now, I'm ready to write.
And this time, no one's silencing me. I gave her everything. Emails, timelines, policy drafts, names. In return, she gave me something more valuable. The truth, corroborated, documented, irrefutable. Within a week, she and the legal team had unearthed financial statements and digital trails linking Westfall Medical to dark money channels that funneled cash into my opponent's campaign. In exchange, those candidates had signed quiet pledges to dismantle healthcare reforms. Worse still, there was Sarah caught in emails accepting unofficial payments for communication consulting while on the governor's staff. It was time. We hosted the press conference at the community center. Still raw, glass still cracked. I left it like that on purpose. The wound had become the symbol. Camera crews arrived. So did live streamers, bloggers, skeptics. I stepped up to the podium, no teleprompter, just a folder of truth and a heart no longer afraid. My name is Carla Whitmore, I said, voice steady. And I am the state senator of Iowa. I was forced into silence so that the guilty could thrive, but no more. I released the documents, real ones, not doctored clips, and showed how the machine had moved against me. I admitted what I'd hidden. I let fear convince me that staying quiet would protect the truth. But the truth doesn't protect itself. It needs a voice. And today that voice is mine. The crowd didn't erupt, not at first, but they listened. And then they shared. Lena's article went live the same hour, hashtag sprouted like spring flowers. We stand with Carla, with a picture of the shattered community center and the caption, "She built truth from broken glass." That afternoon, the governor's office announced Sarah had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The state's ethics committee launched an inquiry into Westfall Medical. Senators who had distanced themselves began releasing public statements calling my comeback a testament to resilience. Even the governor, in a surprise TV appearance, admitted we underestimated her. But Iowa is better for what she endured and what she refused to let break her. I wasn't whole yet, but I was no longer hiding. And for the first time in years, the ground beneath me felt like mine again. A few days after the press conference, I found a letter in my mailbox, handwritten, the edges softened by time, or maybe just by hesitant fingers. It was from my mother. We hadn't exchanged anything in years, not since I walked out of that house and into the void. She told me my father had passed. A sudden stroke, she wrote. It happened fast. She found him in his chair, holding an old photo of me from my law school days, the one where my smile was uncertain. But my eyes were stubborn. He'd been crying, she said. The final line of the letter was simple, but it carved deeper than I expected. He never knew how to love you the right way, but he never stopped being proud of you. And I never stopped missing you, asterisk. I didn't cry. Not then. I just placed the letter on my desk beside my journal and let it stay there like a witness. I didn't write back. I wasn't ready to forgive, but I wasn't willing to forget either. That letter lived between both truths.
The next day, Leo showed up at my office. He didn't schedule a visit, just knocked and waited. When I opened the door, I saw on his face the boy I used to protect, and the man who had forgotten who I was at a gala built for masks. I thought if I followed the rules, played the part, I'd finally be respected.
He said that I lost my compass. I didn't let the silence linger too long. You don't have to be anyone, Star Leo, I said, my voice softer than I meant it to be. You just have to be kind. He nodded, eyes glossy but holding steady. Then he stepped forward and hugged me. No drama, no sobbing, just the kind of quiet that heals when nothing else can. That night, I drafted an email to Daniel. It wasn't an apology, it wasn't a plea. It was simply this. I didn't hide from you because I didn't trust you. I hid because I didn't think I deserved to be trusted. If you can forgive me, I'd be honored to see you at tomorrow's ceremony, not for me, but for justice. He didn't reply, but the next morning he was there. Standing near the back, hands folded, no fanfare, just presence. When our eyes met, he gave me a small nod. That was enough. That said everything.
The education reform bill, stalled, buried beneath the weight of my scandal, was revived. It returned to the floor under a new name, the Monroe Bill, a tribute to the name I once had to hide behind to do the work that mattered.
I stood to speak before the chamber. I don't care if they remember my name, I said, but I hope the kids in Glenbrook remember their worth being heard. And if I have to keep shouting for them, I will, until the silence isn't something they have to survive. In the months that followed, I used the little clout I had left to launch a new foundation, one named, not for me, but for the woman who raised me with quiet strength. Even if she never found the words, the Janine Foundation for Justice, dedicated to whistleblowers, especially women in public service and education. At the opening ceremony, an older woman approached me, her hands trembling slightly. I was laughed out of a school board hearing for calling out harassment, she said, but today, a senator looked me in the eye and said, "You deserve to be believed. Thank you for that." And I finally realized my voice was never just mine. There's a small room behind my office, not an official archive, just a place with a worn couch, old filing cabinets, and a wooden box that I keep under a shelf. Every night I stay late, I open it like a ritual. Inside are fragments of my journey. My mother's letter, the paper now slightly curled, a headline from a decade ago with more scandal exploding. The tear-stained note from a photo of me and Daniel at a Glenbrook town hall. Both younger, both pretending not to hope too much. I don't keep these things out of sentiment. I keep them as proof of pain and doubt, of fights worth fighting, of names that had been heard when no one else thought they did.
At the final session of the legislative year, I was invited to speak. They expected a list of accomplishments. Instead, I told a story.
I once had a different name. I began, and in that name, I learned how to listen. I was silenced by those I loved and by those in power. But silence becomes a weapon only when you give it to someone else to use against you. Today, I reclaim it not to stay quiet, but to speak for those who can't yet.
The chamber rose in applause, but I wasn't watching them. I saw a young intern in the back row, barely 20, trying not to cry. That's who I spoke to. That's who I needed to reach.
I chose not to run for re-election. When asked why, I said simply, I don't need a title to keep fighting. I just need to look in the mirror and know I'm not silent.
I started teaching part-time at a small law school in Iowa, the same one that had once disciplined a student for speaking out. And every few weeks I returned to Glenbrook, not as Kate Monroe, not as Senator M, but just Carla, a woman who once had everything stripped away and found something better beneath. Leo went on to work in community outreach, not politics, just on his service. At one of my workshops, Daniel showed up again. No conversation, no declarations, but he stayed, and that was something. My family wasn't whole, but we spoke now. Not to defend, not to condemn, just to hear each other. Sometimes that's enough. And on my desk today, there's a note I wrote to myself. Silence doesn't scare me anymore. It's just a space where I get to choose what matters enough to speak. Sometimes it takes being broken to understand the strength of standing whole. Silence can be a prison or a choice, and when we choose to speak, even after being silenced, we reclaim not just our voice, but our worth. No journey is ever simple, but the scars we carry, they are proof we survived and chose not to disappear. If this story moved you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, and please consider subscribing. Your support keeps these stories alive.